Please the débat, the honourable member for Cardigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today to speak on Bill S-3, an act to amend the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act. Fisheries are so important to many areas of the country, and it's certainly important in my area in Prince Edward Island. And around Cardigan and Prince Edward Island, if we lost the fishery, every community depends on the fishing industry where I live and represent. So this legislation is important. There's a lot more than this legislation important, but that's important. Over 1,300 lobster fishers on PEI and 11,000 inshore fishers in Atlantic Canada and another 20,000 crew. That's well over 30,000 people involved in the fishery just in the Atlantic region of Canada, not to mention the processing industry and other indirect jobs involved in the fishery. That's a lot on the inshore fishery, Mr. Speaker. Fisheries are worth about $1 billion to the value of Atlantic Canada alone. Canada's commercial fishery, agriculture, and fish and seafood processing industry contribute $5.4 billion and 71,000 full-time jobs to the Canadian economy every year. Our many coastal communities are equally reliant on having a strong fishery and an effective enforcement against illegal fishery activities. At times, it can be difficult to get people to understand out of the Atlantic region and from the West Coast exactly what the value of the fishery is and how important the fishery is to the economy. Fish does not come from a showcase, it comes from the sea, and it's important that we have the funds to and the surveillances and the protection to make sure the stock survives. So I'm so pleased to say a few words on this issue today. This bill will allow Canada to meet its international obligations with regard to the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization Agreement on Port State measures to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, or the Port State Measures Agreement. Mr. Speaker, illegal, unreported, and unregulated, or IUU fishing, undermines the livelihood of fishers who play by the rules, both within Canada and around the world. The global economy loss due to illegal fishing is somewhere between $10 and $23 billion annually and represents somewhere between 1 and 26 million tonnes of fish lost to illegal fish activity, a loss of 18% in the total fishery. This is a staggering number, and it is my hope that Canada, along with many other countries around the world, will continue its effort to decrease this massive economic loss. We know that our inshore fishers are hurting, and we need to do everything we can to help them receive a proper dollar for the world-class product that they produce. In a perfect world, there would be no illegal fisheries. Vessels would be all registered with identifying numbers, making them all identifiable and authorities to fish and authorized to fish by their flag states. It would also be possible to identify the owners of these vessels. But the fact is, there is far too much illegal fishery across the world, which is having a devastating effect on the fishery worldwide. And no matter where you fish, it has an effect because it provides an illegal product that is in competition. It's important that Canada plays a strong role in cracking down on the illegal fishery, not only to protect fishers' livelihood, but also to help the conservation of our fishery and the entire Canadian economy, of which our fishers and seafood industry play such a major role. If there's any excess supply of fish on the market because of some illegal fish activity, prices may be driven down, which would hurt our economy and our coastal communities and hurt the many thousands of Canadians who make their living on the sea. Mr. Speaker, Canada has been long considered such a leader in the fight to combat pirate or IUU fishing. I am extremely proud that the Liberals have taken many steps in the past years to combat the illegal fishing activity. As far back as 1956, Liberal Minister of Fishery James Sinclair indicated that Canada favoured a 12-mile territorial zone. Then in 1977, former Liberal Minister of Fisheries Romeo LeBlanc established the 200-mile fishing zone that protected Canadian fishermen from foreign trawlers. Mr. Speaker, Mr. LeBlanc was instrumental in the establishment of the 200-mile limit and in shaping the international law of the sea. Another Liberal Minister of Fisheries, Brian Tobin, mounted a fierce campaign through 1994 against the foreign overfishing on waters on the nose and tail of the Grand Banks, located just outside Canada's declared 200-mile zone. Canadians across the country took note of this new and aggressive posture, a posture that has not been taken by any Minister of Fisheries since the 200-mile zone had been declared in 1977. In 1994, Coastal Fisheries Protection Act was amended to extend its application to the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization, or NAFO, regulatory area, which is a very significant area of the Atlantic Ocean on the high seas. It was the Liberal government that amended that act. In April 1995, DFO was involved in the so-called Turbot War, which pits Canadians against the European Union. Nevertheless, Fisheries Minister Tobin and the Liberal government of the day received the full backing of the United Kingdom and Ireland in this fight. Later that month, Mr. Tobin held an international news conference from a barge on the East River outside the United Nations headquarters, where he displayed a legal trawl net that had been allegedly cut from a Spanish trawler, which was arrested outside the Canadian zone on international waters. In 1999, the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act was again amended by a Liberal government. This time it was to implement the agreement for the implementation of the provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea of the 10th of December 1982, relating to the conservation and management of straddling stocks, fish stocks, and high migratory fish stocks of 1995. These amendments in 1999 allowed Canada to further implement international fisheries treaties and added regulatory powers to the government. During his time as Minister of Fisheries and Oceans, my colleague from Halifax West was a strong advocate for the elimination of the illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Under his leadership, the Department of Fisheries and Oceans made significant investments to expand aerial surveillance and at-sea patrols in the Northwest Atlantic Fisheries Organization regulatory area. The increase in patrols and surveillance led to the reduction in non-compliant behavior and a decrease of 29% of foreign fishing vessels in the NRA. My colleague from Halifax West was also an active member of the High Seas Task Force, an international task force committed to stopping IUU fishing in parts of the ocean not under the exclusive control of sovereign states. In addition to this, he hosted an international conference on global overfishing, which attracted fisheries and oceans ministers from around the world. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a very proud tradition in this party of a strong and effective leadership and action on illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing activity. Canada is considered a leader in combating illegal fishing activities, and the Liberal Party and the Liberal government has made a strong contribution in ensuring that our system is strong. I am pleased the government has brought forward this bill and intends to join the Port State Measures Agreement. However, I do wonder why the government recently took away $4.2 million from Canada's offshore surveillance of foreign fishing vessels. This will result in a significant reduction in Canada's monitoring capability and has been done as part of the government's gutting of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. In fact, Mr. Speaker, this will result in a reduction in the total of NAFO sea days from 785 to 60, and a reduction in NAFO air hours from 1,000 to 600, along with the loss of 23 full-time employees. It's fine to bring this bill that lets Canada meet its international obligations, but the government needs to put teeth in the bill. We need money in order to make sure we can enforce the legislation. I hope the government can respond and indicate why they made this cut to Canada's offshore surveillance of foreign fishing vessels and what effect they think it will have. Gutting DFO and taking a significant amount of money away from offshore surveillance was wrong, and I hope the government will rethink that and many other cuts that they did in DFO. The government has downloaded extra costs to our fishers, such as tags, at-sea observers, and logbooks. They have made changes on the quotas and taken them from fishers in order to pay for scientific research, which should be the responsibility of the Government of Canada, not fishers. They have made drastic cuts to DFO signs, fisheries and conservation officers, the Coast Guard, small craft harbours, ignored the price crisis in the lobster fishery, and spent near a year considering whether they should eliminate the owner-operator fleet separation policy. However, I am pleased to say that we are generally quite supportive of the bill the government has brought forward and Canada's ratification of the Port State Measures Agreement. As I mentioned earlier, Bill S-3 has 3 points: to implement the Port State Measures Agreement, prohibit importing illegal fish and marine plants, and clarify administration and enforcement powers in the Act. The bill contains a number of amendments to the Coastal Fisheries Protection Act in order to implement the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization 2009 agreement on the port state measures to prevent, deter, and eliminate the unreported and unregulated fishery. Mr. Speaker, on November the 22nd, 2009, a conference of the FAO approved the Port State Measures Agreement. Canada signed the agreement on November the 19th, 2010, but has yet to ratify it. The amendments to the Act and its regulations are necessary for Canada to meet its commitments to this important international agreement. The agreement will enter into force 30 days after 25 countries have ratified. I believe 11 countries have presently ratified the agreement, and another 18 have signed on, with the indication that they will ratify this agreement. From my understanding, government officials are hopeful that the PSMA will enter into force in 1 or 2 years. The application of the Port State Measures Act will contribute to harmonizing port state measures, enhance regional and international cooperation, and block the flow of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fish into national and international markets. Enhanced port state control can act as a disincentive to those who take part in illegal fishery by increasing the cost of their operations. And just for an example, if they're permitted from coming into one port, they'll have to find another port. Their costs will increase. And of course, hopefully that we will have something in place to make sure they do not enter any port. That's what this agreement is all about. The FAO described the Port Measures Agreement by saying the agreement aims to prevent illegally caught fish from entering international markets through ports. Under the terms of the treaty, foreign vessels will provide advance notice of their request permission for port entry. Countries will conduct regular inspections in accordance with universal minimum standards. Offending vessels will be denied the use of port or certain port services, and information will be shared among the countries that have signed. The IUU fishing poses a considerable threat to the conservation and management of many fish stocks, and it can lead to the loss of economic revenue, impair the conditions of the stock, or at worst, can have a stock collapse. This must be something which we in this country need to be extremely vigilant and guard against. Liberals do support the main thrust of this piece of legislation and support sending Bill S-3 to committee for review. I do wonder why the government signed the Port State Measures Agreement in 2010 and have waited 4 years before bringing this legislation to the House. Perhaps the government could shed some light on that. But, Mr. Speaker, over the next number of years, there's going to be a major demand on fish products. It is estimated that the world cannot supply the demand for fish and protein that will be needed in the world in the next 25 years. That's why it's so important that governments invest in the protection of our fish stocks, our fishers, and the safety of our fishermen. As I mentioned, downloading of tags and on and sea observers and logbooks, all these costs go against our small fishermen. The small craft harbours budget, the slashing of the small craft harbours budget from, it was at one time, Mr. Speaker, over $200 million, and now it's under $100 million. Now, I know the government announced $40 million over 2 years. I don't know when that will come, but I can assure you where I represent, it's well needed. There have been many other major cuts of DFO over the last number of years. Up to 2017, it'll be about $300 million. Mr. Speaker, DFO just cannot afford this type of slashing. Also, it's awful hard for me to understand why, number one, the government needed to bring this piece of legislation forward. But just before they did, they cut $4.2 million from our offshore surveillance. Mr. Speaker, this will mean that NAFO sea days will be cut, as I said, from 785 to 600 days. The air time will be cut from 1,000 to 600. And the employees that are desperately needed, not only there but many other places, on this particular cut, is 23, but that's only a small amount that has been sliced at a DFO. As other speakers have indicated, we've cut search and rescue offices on the East Coast and the West Coast. Any sensible human being would kind of think that on the coast you would have search and rescue offices, but obviously this government does not agree that we should have them on the East Coast and off the coast of British Columbia. These are things, Mr. Speaker, that are so important, and we take a strong look at. Again, I say the S-3 is important. It's important that it goes to committee. We will support it going to committee. We will also be evaluating the S-3 at committee, but also the government must realize if it's going to put anything in place in order to work with countries around the world, we have to take care of ourselves. We cannot be continually slicing, cutting and gutting the departments that are in charge of making sure that we're observing. If we do not have the planes out to keep an eye on the foreign fishing vessels, I ask you, Mr. Speaker, how are we going to know what's going on? How are we going to know what vessel is coming in? We will not. The fact is, and I'm sure the Minister of Foreign Affairs fully agrees with me, that we need to put more money into this in order to make sure that we're able to catch the people that illegally fish. Indeed, the Minister of Foreign Affairs is very concerned about the constituents in Critic, and they know that. But, Mr. Speaker, in all fairness, this is a vital piece of legislation to deal with the world community, but we've got a big job here at home. You cannot take everything away. We cannot continually slice and cut the very requirements that we need in order to enforce this type of legislation. So I hope the government will take a strong look at that, and I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for his comments. I just wanted to raise one point. I know he and other members have referred to supposed cuts to DFO's enforcement powers. The figures that they're using are not accurate, but I wonder if he knows that that DFO has sponsored the 4th annual Global Fisheries Enforcement Training Workshop, and I think that's important because I think we need to realize in the context of this issue that there are fisheries that take place on the high seas. they're outside of the 200-mile limit of any country, as he alluded to in his comments, and there is illegal, IUU fishing taking place there, and this agreement will help regulate that fishing, because if they have no place where they can kind of legally land it, eventually the illegal fishing will dry up. But a greater percentage of the illegal fishing actually takes place within the 200-mile limits of largely developing countries. So Canada is playing a very significant role in the training of other jurisdictions, because countries around the world look to us for the good example that we have in terms of protection and conservation and enforcement. So that's a good thing, and I think he'd agree with me on that. I would ask him, though, if he is thinking that there's any specific areas that would require amendment in committee so that we can begin to think about those.
The honourable member for Cardigan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have a great respect for the Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Fisheries, and I also appreciate that at least we're still able to host a global training program for whatever part of the training we're going to be providing for the world community. But as I said when I spoke, and my concern is today, I think that chance is dwindling and dwindling, because we're firing experts the whole time. It's just impossible to understand the rationale behind. I think it's great. I think it's great that we have the expertise. But I have to wonder to the Parliamentary Secretary, I have to wonder to you, Mr. Speaker, and my colleagues, how long is this going to take place? I mean, we had a renowned, the experimental lakes area in Northern Ontario, $1.75 million it cost this government. They cut it. The world community uses these things. We have to provide, not only, we have some expertise left, and it's great that we do, but if we continue to fire or eliminate the scientists, the people that know what's going on in the fishing community in this world, the people that are renowned worldwide, if we do not have these people on our payroll under the Canadian government in DFO, we will not be able to provide the good program that my honourable Parliamentary Secretary for the Minister of Fisheries has just indicated. That's what I was trying to indicate to this House and to the people, that if you're going to be able to keep these programs in place, keep the respect internationally, we have to be able to take care of ourselves at home, and we will not be able to take care of ourselves if we continue slicing DFO, continue closing offices on the East Coast and the West Coast. We just cannot continue this track, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question et commentaires.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil, Pierre Boucher. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And indeed, people in Longueuil, Pierre Boucher, are very concerned by the environmental situation in terms of the fisheries. And I'll remind you that we are starting to clean up the shorelines across the country as of this weekend, and I hope everyone will be participating in this activity. So I'm often in touch with the people organizing that shoreline cleanup, and one of their members the other day said to me, quite rightly, that he was very concerned about overfishing. And I would like to ask my colleague if he believes that Canada is really doing its part in order to deal with this situation and do away with overfishing, particularly if we think that illegal fishing contributes to the problem.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his question. Number one, congratulations and thank you very much. Taking care of the environment is so important. Thank the people that are doing it. We need to be more aware. Cleaning up our coastlines is so important. The environmental situation, as you mentioned, and I touched on before, Mr. Speaker, when the experimental lakes area was hit by this government, it was impossible to believe that the likes of that would happen. A renowned area that most everything you drink, clean the floor with, if it's liquid, if it's invasive species, no matter what it is, worldwide. This was dealt with the 57 lakes in the experimental lake area, and still is, I might add, but no thanks to the present government of Canada. They had to pull out. for the sake of $1.75 million. Also, if my honourable colleague recalls, they started tearing down the buildings, but we made a little fuss, and I believe that stopped. My understanding is that the one or two of the buildings destroyed, which was too bad, but we did get it stopped. These types of things, if you're going to meet and deal with the world community, you have to do your share. But what we have to do, Mr. Speaker, is do our share in this country. This legislation is important. We have to deal with it and come with it in committee, but it deals with meeting requirements. But we have to meet the requirements of DFO in this country. That's all I'm saying. We must. The red legislation is excellent, but we have to meet the requirements that are needed in this country for surveillance, safety. One of the most dangerous jobs in the world is to go out deep-sea fishing. Mr. Speaker, please, this government needs to realize that and put the money where it's needed. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable member for Kingston and the Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't live on the coast. I live in Ontario. And the freshwater fisheries in Ontario is a very important part of our economy. And what's always needed is resources for surveillance to make sure that there isn't overfishing or illegal fishing. And so I'm very, I also believe that this legislation is important, but I would like to ask my colleague to expound a little bit on the importance of having resources, and this means dollars, in order to do the surveillance so that the billions of dollars in value that are being lost can be protected.
The honourable member for Cardigan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague from Kingston and the Islands. And the Great Lakes fishery is a vitally important fishery in this country. We deal with it at committee. One of the issues in particular that's so important is invasive species. And you cannot deal with these issues unless you have the funds in order to have the observe and make sure that we know what's coming in and going out of the Great Lakes. The problem that I see, and the problem that my colleague from Kingston and the island has, is that the continual gutting and cutting of DFO means that we do not have the people in place in order to make sure that the invasive species that can come into my honourable colleagues' riding and into the Great Lakes, if we do not have the required investment in the Department of Fisheries and Oceans or with the Government of Canada, we cannot make sure that these very important fisheries in the Great Lakes are preserved. I urge the government again to make sure that they take a long look at the loss that it will have to our economy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The honourable parliamentary secretary to the Minister of International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague from Cardigan for his speech here in the House today. There was a lot of history to his speech, talking about long past triumphs. So I have to talk about my personal history, Mr. Speaker. When I was in the Air Force, I had the pleasure of serving on HMCS St. John's and actually participating in some of our fisheries enforcement measures, along with fisheries officers who would come on the ship, and our Sea King crew would be on the Flemish Cap patrolling our exclusive economic zone, and we saw some of those trawlers out there, Mr. Speaker. So it's important that we enforce our sovereignty. We support the industry. So I have a personal history here that keeps me passionate why I support S-3 fully. My two questions for the honourable member. First would be based on the Port State Measures Agreement. Does he not agree that it's important for Canada to be part of that and to update global definitions related to fishing vessels, fishing, that sort of thing, to make sure that we address the modern fleets out there? And second, Mr. Speaker, he spoke a lot about our small fishermen, and these are some of the hardest working Canadians. I've seen it firsthand. Does he not recognize that our European trade agreement presents the most exciting opportunity for Atlantic Canada in a generation? Tariff rates in the double digits dropping, Mr. Speaker, for the lobster and mussels that I know his province sells well. Isn't that a boon for our industry, Mr. Speaker?
The honourable member for Cardigan, you only have about a minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable parliamentary secretary for his intervention. And I appreciate the boats he was on, but the only problem he has is that he arrived here at the day that they formed a majority government. My concern is the day he leaves, there'll be no boats, no nothing. There'll be nothing. My concern is, Mr. Speaker, and I'm trying to inform the House, is that the path that this majority Conservative government is on total destruction. They do not seem to understand the value of the fishery, particularly on the coasts. Now, he did indicate, Mr. Speaker, about the importance of S-3 and the Port State Measures Agreement. Of course we agree with the Port State Measures Agreement. But what I'm trying to tell you is that here in this country, we're not doing what we need to do in order to protect our own fishermen and to make sure that we know what's going on out in the sea, Mr. Speaker, that we know what boats are out there. We need patrol. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.